Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal in the blistering heat of a Port Charles summer, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with tension and the whispers of old secrets clung to every brick and branch of Spoon Island, the legacy of the Cassadine family, long thought to be fading into myth, was quietly preparing for a violent resurrection. Beneath the gleaming surface of pool parties at the Metro Court and the rhythmic normalcy of the hospital's daily chaos, something ancient and dangerous was awakening. Windermere, once the beating heart of Cassadine cruelty, now belonged to Sidwell, a man whose cruelty wasn't loud like Helena's, nor theatrical like Victor's. It was methodical, surgical, and terrifying in its precision. But even Sidwell's ruthless grip couldn't suppress the darker truth brewing just beyond public view. What haunted Windermere now wasn't a ghost, it was a name. A name that had once belonged to a forgotten infant, a pawn in a family war, a boy left behind when the bloodshed died down. That name was Ace. For years, Ace had existed as little more than a tragic footnote in the twisted chronicles of the Cassadines. Orphaned by Esme's death and left legally adrift after Nicholas's imprisonment, he became a child raised not by family, but by function. Managed through trusts and legal proxies, spoken of rarely, and seen even less. Many believed he had been placed in protective custody, perhaps overseas, his fortune locked away until he came of age. But the truth was far more insidious. The Davis family, led by the ostensibly reformed Alexis, had taken control of Ace's legal and financial welfare under the guise of moral responsibility. What began as guardianship had, over time, transformed into exploitation. Alexis, who had spent her career railing against the moral decay of the Cassadines, had succumbed to the very corruption she once vowed to destroy. Beset by a scandal of her own, a long-buried ethical breach from her DA tenure that had finally come to light, she found herself vulnerable to blackmail. And instead of confronting the consequences with transparency, she used Ace's inheritance as a lifeline. She siphoned funds, disguised the transactions under vague legal expenses, and made quiet settlements to ensure the truth remained buried. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself no one would ever know. But the money trail told another story. The discovery of her betrayal wasn't the result of a whistleblower or a vindictive family member. It was mathematics. A flawed update in the fiduciary oversight software triggered an automatic compliance review. A pattern of transfers. Too small to flag individually but too frequent to ignore, emerged. Within days, a quiet investigation had begun, and within weeks, the scandal exploded into the public eye. Alexis's name, once synonymous with resilience and reform, now topped headlines alongside phrases like embezzlement, financial misconduct, and fraud against a minor. But if the world was shocked, Ace was not. Because Ace, for all his silence, had been watching. The boy who had once been powerless was no longer a child. Somehow, somewhere, Ace had grown, faster than anyone expected, smarter than anyone assumed, and colder than anyone could have imagined. In private, he had been studying the Cassadine history not as a tragic inheritance, but as a manual. He had learned from Victor's manipulation, Helena's psychological warfare, and Valentine's flair for reinvention. He understood that power wasn't inherited. It was seized. And now, with the revelation of Alexis's theft, he had the perfect excuse to take it. Ace's return to Port Charles was not marked by fanfare or teary reunions. It was marked by silence and calculation. He arrived without press, without family, and without apology. His first move wasn't emotional, it was legal. A petition to the court to assume full control of his assets. A motion to freeze the Davis estate. A request for forensic audit into every dollar spent since the trust was activated. And an injunction preventing Alexis from contacting him directly. Within 48 hours, the legal world of Port Charles was in chaos. Alexis's former allies began distancing themselves. Past clients filed motions to re-examine verdicts tied to her rulings. The law school where she once lectured issued a formal statement condemning the alleged misconduct. Molly resigned from her position in the DA's office, citing irreconcilable ethical conflict. Christina withdrew from her foundation's partnership with city government. Sam, ever the pragmatist, refused to speak to any of them. The Davis women, once seen as pillars of strength and progressive leadership, were shattered by the weight of one decision. But this wasn't just a personal reckoning for Alexis. It was a declaration of war by Ace. And war, for a Cassadine, was never just about revenge. It was about control. He began orchestrating a silent acquisition of Cassadine properties long since considered dormant. Land in Greece, art stored in private vaults, patents linked to medical technology developed under Cassadine funding. He established a new foundation, not for charity, but for influence. He began buying into Port Charles, real estate, shares in the Metro Court, even a shadow stake in the hospital board. People began to whisper. Was this boy truly Nicholas's son, or something more dangerous? A new breed of Cassadine, engineered not by birthright, but by betrayal. Sidwell, despite his ruthlessness, quickly recognized the threat. A private meeting was requested, but denied. Ace made it clear, he would not meet in secret. If Sidwell wanted a seat at the table, he would have to acknowledge Ace publicly. That refusal shattered the fragile alliance of silence that had long governed the Cassadine sphere. The house of cards began to fall. Within weeks, Ace replaced Alexis on the Cassadine Board of Trustees. He funded a full review of all Cassadine criminal ties to ensure no lingering vulnerabilities. He hired private security to guard Windmere and had the entire estate swept for surveillance, a message to Sidwell that his reign was neither invisible nor absolute. But what truly cemented Ace's place in the narrative wasn't the legal victories or the financial chess moves. It was his demeanor. Cold, polite, and deliberate, he spoke rarely in public, but when he did, his words landed like steel. He didn't threaten. He promised. And the city began to understand that the little boy once considered too young, too fragile, and too innocent was now the most dangerous man in Port Charles. The Davis family, once seen as victims of Cassadine legacy, now bore the mark of its revival. Alexis was facing criminal indictment. Her daughters were fractured. And Ace had built a dynasty from the ashes of their deception. Not through chaos. Through order. Through logic. Through power. In a city that had seen its fair share of darkness, Ace did not come as a storm. He came as the calm before one. And for the first time in decades, the people of Port Charles realized that the most dangerous Cassadine wasn't the one who shouted from the shadows, but the one who said nothing at all, until it was too late. No one in Port Charles could have foreseen the magnitude of the fallout that would erupt once the truth about Alexis's financial misconduct came to light. The scandal didn't just fracture public trust, it sent shockwaves through every corner of the town's interconnected families and institutions. What began as a quietly buried betrayal, Alexis siphoning money from the trust fund of her young relative, Ace, quickly spiraled into a legal and emotional firestorm, engulfing not only the Davis family but the fragile remnants of the Cassadine legacy itself. At the center of this storm stood Ace, still only a child, far too young to comprehend the full scope of the betrayal that had robbed him of not just money, but security, trust, and stability. Yet it was his name, his birthright, that was now at the heart of every legal brief, every whispered conversation at the Metro Court, and every headline. But while Ace himself was too young to wage war, he was not without protection. Laura, his grandmother and now legal guardian, rose with fierce resolve to shield him from the fallout. Laura had spent much of her life enduring the pain that came from her tangled history with the Cassadines, and she had sworn to break the cycle of trauma that had cursed each generation. She had seen what the Cassadine name had done to Nicholas, to Spencer, to countless others. Now, with Ace in her care, she was determined not to let history repeat itself. The moment she learned the extent of Alexis's deception, Laura moved swiftly, petitioning the court to launch a full investigation, hiring independent auditors to examine every transaction made under Alexis's oversight and demanding full legal autonomy over Ace's financial and personal affairs. What began as a quiet scandal quickly transformed into a deeply public reckoning, and Laura was prepared to fight it head-on, not only for justice, but for the future of the boy she now considered her responsibility. Spencer, who had long tried to distance himself from the treacherous shadows of his family's legacy, found himself reluctantly pulled into the center of the legal storm. Though his focus had shifted in recent months toward carving out his own identity outside the Cassidy name, a court summons arrived that could not be ignored. As someone who had been present during several key meetings and financial discussions years prior, many of which involved the legal structuring of the family's wealth, Spencer was now being called to testify. Lawyers acting on behalf of Ace's trust demanded he provide sworn testimony regarding internal decisions, including those made during the brief period when he served as a vocal opponent of Nicholas's increasingly erratic decisions. The irony was not lost on him. The very legacy he had tried so hard to escape was now pulling him back in, not through blood loyalty, but through legal obligation. Even more startling was the sudden reappearance of Nicholas's name in the court proceedings. Despite being incarcerated and cut off from public life, Nicholas was unexpectedly summoned to verify key documents, power of attorney agreements and trust fund amendments signed during his final months of control over the Cassidy estate. These documents, many of them forged under Helena's manipulative influence, were now at the center of the inquiry. Nicholas, weakened but still cunning, recognized the leverage his involvement gave him and began negotiating with authorities for leniency in exchange for cooperation. His testimony had the potential to vindicate, or further implicate, Alexis, and Nicholas had no reason to protect anyone but himself. As the Cassidy family unraveled once more into bitter factions, the person at the center, Ace, remained a silent, innocent figure. But it was this very silence, this inability to defend himself, that made the public fury more intense. Port Charles had seen corruption before, but this, stealing from a child, and one so closely tied to a family as cursed as the Cassidines, felt unforgivable. And as public pressure mounted, so did the legal consequences. For Alexis, the consequences were catastrophic. Already shamed in the press, she now faced disciplinary review by the state bar, multiple civil suits, and the very real possibility of criminal charges. What stung the most, however, was the personal fallout. Molly, her daughter and once her greatest defender, publicly withdrew her support and announced she would not represent her mother in any future proceedings. Christina, devastated by years of half-truths and manipulations, expressed her heartbreak by stepping back from all family gatherings and refusing to answer Alexis's calls. Sam, cold and resolute, severed ties completely, declaring that Alexis had crossed an ethical boundary from which she could never return. What Alexis had tried to preserve, her family's image, her legacy as a reformer, and the respect of the Port Charles community, was now reduced to ash. Her name became a subject of hushed judgment at the Metro Court, her presence no longer welcome in the very legal circles she once commanded. Worse still, rumors began to swirl that a class action lawsuit was forming, led by a group of former clients and trust beneficiaries who suspected Alexis's misconduct extended far beyond Ace's account. Some believed she had dipped into other family funds as well, exploiting her authority to settle personal debts and hush old mistakes. Within the hospital, where her name had once evoked admiration for her advocacy work, staff began to whisper. Could Ace eventually fund a massive lawsuit against the very legal framework that had failed to protect him? Nurses, administrators, and lawyers began to quietly distance themselves, hoping to avoid the fallout. Even the mayor's office, Laura's domain, felt the ripples. While Laura fought to defend her grandson and restore dignity to his name, she also faced scrutiny over how such financial abuse could have gone unnoticed for so long. Through it all, Ace remained a child, fragile, observant, and now permanently shaped by the knowledge that even the people entrusted with his care could betray him. Laura knew that scars like these didn't fade quickly. So while the city turned its gaze toward the scandal and the courtrooms filled with arguments and accusations, she focused on something far more important, shielding her grandson's heart from the wreckage. She held him a little closer at night, read him stories with more tenderness, and made sure he never felt the weight of headlines or legal jargon. But deep down, Laura knew this would not be the end. The Cassidy name had once again become a symbol of danger and division, and as Ace grew older, the world would remember what had been done to him, not as a boy who inherited wealth, but as a boy who was nearly destroyed by the very people sworn to protect him. And so the seeds of the future were quietly planted. Whether Ace would grow into the kind of man who forgave, or the kind who reclaimed what was his with vengeance in his veins, remained to be seen. But Port Charles would never forget that a single betrayal, one woman's desperate attempt to cover her past, had cracked open the fragile wall between justice and legacy, leaving a child to pick up the pieces of a family name once again soaked in scandal. Ace did not say a word when the scandal unfolded. He did not call a press conference. He issued no carefully crafted statements through lawyers. There was no televised appearance, no declaration of intent, and certainly no promises of revenge. That would have been impossible, because Ace was still only a little boy. Small in stature, soft in voice, and far too young to grasp the full scale of the storm that now surrounded him. Yet his silence was not the silence of strategy or menace, it was the silence of a child caught in the middle of a legacy that had always punished the innocent. A silence that screamed of betrayal, confusion, and abandonment. A silence that demanded protection. And in Port Charles, there was only one person willing, and strong enough, to stand between that child and the darkness that threatened to consume him. That person was Laura. Laura, Ace's grandmother and now legal guardian, had spent years fighting the ghosts of her past, some she married, some she buried, and some that still lingered in every corner of Windmere. She had watched Nicholas lose himself to the weight of the Cassidy name. She had witnessed Spencer's spirit erode under the constant pressure of expectation and deception. And now, with Ace, she had vowed that it would be different. She would not allow the sins of those who came before to shape the soul of the child left in her care. But when the financial misconduct came to light, when it was discovered that Alexis, a longtime family ally and legal overseer, had siphoned funds from Ace's inheritance to cover her own scandalous past, Laura's resolve became something fiercer, something unshakable. This was no longer about name or legacy. It was about defending a child. The revelations had landed like a thunderclap. Port Charles, long used to whispers of Cassidy treachery, was not prepared for a betrayal that cut this close to home. Alexis, who had built a second career as a champion of justice and legal integrity, now stood accused of using her position to secretly tap into Ace's trust. Money left behind for his future, meant to shield him from the very kind of instability he had now been thrust into. What made it worse was how long the deception had gone undetected. Transactions cleverly disguised as legal fees and protective disbursements had quietly drained funds into shell accounts, used to silence a blackmailer tied to Alexis's own past misconduct during her time in the district attorney's office. When the truth emerged, thanks to an unexpected system alert from a banking institution during a routine audit, Laura acted without hesitation. She froze the remaining assets in the Cassidy Trust, demanded a full forensic review, and filed formal complaints against Alexis with the state bar. She hired a private legal team of her own, as well as independent investigators, not to seek revenge, but to uncover the full scope of what had been done to Ace. This wasn't just about financial restitution. This was about rebuilding trust, safeguarding the emotional and psychological well-being of a boy who had already lost both parents under tragic, complex circumstances. Ace, though too young to orchestrate the fallout, became the epicenter of it all. Not because he wanted to be, but because he had no choice. As legal proceedings ramped up, the adults around him scrambled to position themselves on the right side of public opinion. The Davis family fractured. Molly, heartbroken and ashamed, issued a terse statement distancing herself from her mother's decisions. Christina, always the emotional compass, went silent. Sam, pragmatic and exhausted, cut off contact entirely. And Alexis, left exposed and humiliated, found herself the subject of both criminal inquiry and public scorn. Rumors swirled rapidly. Was Laura preparing to sue Alexis personally? Would the Cassadine family's holdings now be transferred entirely to a new trust, managed independently? Some in the media speculated that Spencer, who had previously expressed a desire to leave the Cassadine legacy behind, would be pulled back into the mess as a material witness. Nicholas, still in custody, was unexpectedly subpoenaed to verify several trust documents and powers of attorney that had been quietly signed during his erratic final months before his disappearance. With every revelation, the web grew larger. The damage, deeper. And through it all, Ace remained quiet. He didn't storm boardrooms. He didn't seek retribution. He simply clung to Laura's hand in public and curled beside her in the dark when nightmares crept in. But it was clear to everyone paying attention, something inside him had shifted. Something was watching. Learning. Absorbing. Laura began to worry not only about the legal battle but about what all of this might do to the soul of her grandson. Would he grow up to fear trust? Would he view love as a mask for manipulation? Or worse? Would he one day come to believe that betrayal was the only language his family ever truly spoke? To protect him, she threw herself deeper into the fray. She pulled him from all public appearances. She refused media requests. She redirected the conversation whenever Ace was brought up in political or legal meetings. But the town was already buzzing.